On a quiet summer night in 1993, a family of 4 vanished without a trace from a remote lakeside cabin in upstate New York. Their shoes were still by the door. Their boat was tied to the dock, and their dinner was left half-finished on the table. It was as if they simply disappeared into thin air, leaving behind nothing but confusion, fear, and one of the most chilling cold cases in modern history. For over 3 decades, the mystery of the Colson family haunted investigators, family, members, and locals who swore something was off about Whispering Pines Lake. Then, in 2024, a routine environmental survey uncovered something strange beneath the lake's surface, something that would shake the case wide open and leave even the most seasoned detectives speechless. It started with a sonar scan that picked up an unusual object resting deep on the lake bed, a large rectangular metal container, wrapped in heavy chain and locked shut with rusted bolts. What investigators found inside changed everything they thought they knew. 2 small bodies, carefully sealed in thick black bags, lay preserved in the cold darkness of the lake. A little boy and a little girl, their remains telling a story of unimaginable horror. Their names were Eric and Maddie Colson, ages 10 and 6, when they disappeared, and they had been missing for over 31 years. The discovery reignited a long-dead investigation, bringing back Sheriff Clayton Braddock, the very same officer who had first responded to the scene in 1993. But as the pieces began to come together, one question loomed larger than ever. What happened to their parents, Ben and Lacey Colson? The cabin had shown no signs of a struggle, no blood, no forced entry, just eerie stillness and the lingering sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Theories had come and gone over the years: abduction, murder, even voluntary disappearance. But none of them fit. Now, with the children found, the pressure was on to find the truth. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a name buried in old records: Reginald Kane, a quiet, unassuming man who had been staying in a nearby cabin at the same time as the Colsons. He had no official booking, no identification, and no known address after 1993. But something about him didn't add up. Witnesses described him as strange, always watching, always alone. And when they began to piece together his past, they found a trail of disturbing behavior, a history of violence, and a mind that had long since unraveled. As the investigation intensified, the search for answers led deep into the woods, across forgotten trails, and into the darkest corners of a man's twisted mind. They found a hidden grave, a handmade cross, and a name carved into the earth: Lacey. Her remains were buried far from the cabin, carefully placed, almost respectfully. Someone had taken the time to give her a final resting place, but it wasn't Kane. His pattern was chaos, not care, which meant someone else had buried her. Someone who had survived that night, someone who had been running ever since. And that someone was about to come out of the shadows. As the search for Reginald Kane resumed, detectives made a stunning discovery: a man living deep in the forest, hiding in plain sight. He didn't run when they found him. He didn't resist. He simply looked at them and said, "I thought it would be you." His name was Ben Colson, the missing father. He had lived in silence for over 30 years, carrying the weight of that night, the loss of his children, and the truth no one ever believed. And now, he was ready to tell his story. But the nightmare wasn't over. Because the man who did this, the man who took his family, was still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to finish what he started. What happened in that cabin in 1993 is about to come to light, and what you're about to hear will leave you breathless. As the investigation deepened, the name Reginald Kane became more than just a suspect. It was a shadow that stretched far beyond Whispering Pines Lake. The deeper Sheriff Braddock and his team dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't the first time someone had vanished under mysterious circumstances in the wilderness. Old police reports from neighboring counties began to surface: hikers who never returned, families who checked into remote cabins and were never seen again. Some of these cases dated back as far as the early 1980s, long before the cops ever set foot near the lake, and while none of them carried the same exact signature, they all shared eerie similarities: no signs of struggle, missing persons last seen near wooded areas, and most chillingly, an absence of any real evidence pointing toward what had happened. Kane's file painted a picture of a man who had lived on the fringes for most of his life. Born in upstate New York in 1965, he was the only child of a single mother who worked double shifts at a textile mill to keep a roof over their heads. His childhood records showed frequent moves, inconsistent schooling, and multiple visits from social workers concerned about neglect. By the time he was a teenager, Kane had already been hospitalized twice for self-harm and violent outbursts. One report described him as emotionally detached, with a fascination for isolation and control. He dropped out of high school at 16 and drifted through odd jobs: gas station clerk, farmhand, maintenance worker, always keeping to himself, always moving on after a few months. The pattern continued into adulthood. In 1988, he was admitted to a psychiatric facility following an incident where he allegedly attacked a stranger in a public park with a hunting knife. According to witnesses, Kane had been muttering to himself, staring at the trees like they were speaking to him. The victim survived but suffered serious injuries. Kane was released 2 months later without formal charges being filed, deemed unfit to stand trial. From there, he seemed to vanish entirely from official records, surfacing only occasionally in employment logs and rental agreements under different names. He was known by Ricky Kane in some circles, by Reggie Kane in others. But one thing remained, consistent wherever he went. Something unsettling followed. In the months leading up to the Coulson family's disappearance, Kane had been working as a seasonal laborer at Whispering Pines Lodge, doing light maintenance and cleaning the cabins between guests. According to former lodge staff, he kept mostly to himself, rarely speaking unless spoken to. He was assigned Cabin 5, which sat near the edge of the property, far enough away from the main lodge that he could come and go unnoticed. No one remembered seeing him interact much with guests, but a few employees recalled strange behavior. Late-night walks along the lake shore, long silences when asked questions, and once, a conversation where he claimed the water whispered secrets to him. One former caretaker, who still lived in the area, told investigators that Kane used to collect old chains and padlocks from discarded equipment around the lodge. When asked why, he reportedly said, "They keep things safe, things that need to stay hidden." At the time, no one thought much of it. Now, with the discovery of the submerged container and the matching chain found buried near Lacey's grave, those words took on a whole new meaning. What troubled Braddock the most was how easily Kane had blended into the background. He wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. He didn't draw attention to himself, didn't raise suspicion. He simply existed in the spaces people overlooked, the corners of campgrounds, the edges of trails, the quiet hours of the night when no one was watching, and yet, he had managed to carry out something so horrific, so meticulously planned, that it had gone undetected for over 3 decades. Ben Coulson, now finally free from the burden of hiding, struggled to make sense of it all. Sitting across from Braddock in the small interview room, he recounted every detail he could remember from that fateful night. He spoke of Kane's presence, of the way he had looked at the family during those first few hours, not with curiosity or friendliness, but with something colder, a predator studying its prey. "I don't think he came to Whispering Pines by accident," Ben said quietly. "I think he chose us." Braddock nodded slowly. That was a theory forming in his mind as well. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was premeditated, calculated. Kane had studied the layout of the cabins, understood the routines of the guests, and waited for the right moment to strike. He had watched the Coulsons, learned their habits, and then, when the time was right, he had acted. But the question remained, why? What drove a man to do something like this? Was it madness? Hatred? Or was it something even darker? As the days passed, more disturbing details emerged. The notebook recovered from Cabin 5 contained pages filled with erratic handwriting, disjointed thoughts, and references to voices only he could hear. There were mentions of the lake taking bad parts, of keeping things quiet, and of children who needed to be put to sleep. Some passages were almost poetic in their horror, describing the act of drowning as a form of peace, of returning to something pure beneath the surface. That, and then there was the cassette tape found in the root cellar. Though badly damaged by water and time, forensic analysts were able to extract fragments of audio. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably a child's voice, not screaming, not crying, but whispering, talking to someone, asking questions, then silence. Then another voice, low and calm, answering in return, not comforting, not cruel, just ... empty. It was impossible to say whether the children had been conscious when they were placed inside the cellar, whether they had begged, fought, or simply accepted what was happening. All that remained was the echo of their final moments, captured in a recording that would haunt anyone who listened to it. The discovery of the second burial site changed everything. For years, the assumption had been that Kane had disposed of the bodies in the lake, trying to erase his crime beneath the weight of the water. But now, it was clear he had wanted them hidden, yes, but not destroyed. He had taken the time to arrange them, to place objects beside them, to leave behind messages only he understood. This wasn't just murder, it was ritual. And if that was true, then Kane's actions weren't random. They followed a logic, however twisted, which meant there could be more victims, more places where he had left his mark. That fear lingered in the back of Braddock's mind as he reviewed maps and case files late into the night. Kane's backpack, recovered from the abandoned hunting cabin, contained a crude sketchbook filled with drawings of lakes, forests, and cabins. Some were labeled with dates and initials. Others had symbols, circles, crosses, spirals that matched markings found at the Coulson crime scene. There was also a list of names. Some were crossed out, others were circled, a few were written in red ink. None of them belonged to the Coulsons. Braddock stared at the page, heart pounding. This wasn't just about one family. This was about something much bigger, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And now, with Kane finally in custody, the real nightmare was only beginning. Ben Coulson sat in the dimly lit interview room, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. The silence between him and Sheriff Braddock was thick, heavy with all the words neither of them wanted to say out loud. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows like it was trying to get in, to hear what was being said. Ben stared at the table, his eyes tired but sharp, like he was still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. 31 years of running, hiding, pretending he didn't exist, and now here he was, back in the same nightmare, telling the same story to the same man, just 31 years older. Sheriff Braddock leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Ben's face. He had seen a lot of things in his time, crime scenes that made grown men vomit, confessions that came out like broken glass, families torn apart by grief and guilt. But this case, this family, it had always felt different, like something deeper than just murder or madness. It felt personal, like it had clawed its way into the lives of everyone it touched. And now, sitting across from the only surviving member of the Coulson family, Braddock could feel the weight of it again, pressing down like the humid air before a storm. "I need to know what happened after you buried Lacey," Braddock said finally, his voice low, steady. "You said you came back to the cabin and the kids were gone. Kane was gone. What did you do next?" Ben exhaled slowly, like he was trying to push the memory out of his lungs. "I didn't know what else to do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't just leave her there. I had to do something. I didn't even know if the kids were alive. I thought maybe they were hiding somewhere. Maybe they ran." He looked up at Braddock then, his eyes filled with something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. "I searched for them for days," he said. "I went back to the cabin every night, hoping they'd come back. I thought maybe they were scared, that they didn't know where else to go, but they never showed up. And the longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was being watched." Braddock nodded. He had read the reports, seen the maps, gone over every inch of the Whispering Pines property in his mind. The woods were dense, thick with pine and birch, the kind of place that swallowed sound and light whole. If someone wanted to disappear, it was the perfect place to do it. But if someone wanted to hide, it was just as good. "You weren't imagining it," Braddock said. "We found footprints near the dock, matching Kane's limp. He was watching you. He never left the area." Ben's hands tightened around the mug. "I knew it," he muttered. "I could feel him, like he was waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to come out of hiding." Braddock leaned forward. "Did you ever see him again after that night?" Ben shook his head. "Not until a few days ago. I saw him near the lake, just standing there. Same jacket, same limp. He looked right at me like he knew I was still alive, like he was waiting for me to come back." There was something in his voice then, not fear, not anger, but something colder, something that made Braddock's stomach twist. It wasn't just that Kane had taken his family, it was that he had made Ben feel like he was part of the story, like he was meant to be there, watching it unfold. Back at the station, the task force was working around the clock. Kane's cabin had yielded more than just a notebook and a jacket. There were maps, sketches, and a list of names, some crossed out, others circled. Some had dates next to them, others just initials. It was like he had been keeping track of something, like he had been planning something bigger than just the Coulson family. Detective Vargas was going over the list with a fine-tooth comb, her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of the patterns. "Some of these names match missing persons reports from other states," she said, flipping through the pages. "Oregon, Michigan, even as far as Maine. These dates go back to the 80s. Braddock looked over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "He wasn't just here by accident," he said. "He was hunting." Vargas nodded, and he wasn't done. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the windows harder now, like it was trying to warn them. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, the sound sharp and sudden, like a gunshot. Braddock turned back to the board, where the Coulson family photos still hung, faded but intact, for smiling faces, frozen in time. He thought about what Ben had said, that Kane had been waiting for him to come back. And now that he had, what was stopping Kane from finishing what he started? Across town, in a small cabin, nestled deep in the woods, Reginald Kane sat alone, staring at the wall like he was trying to see through it. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the floor. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just sat there, his hands resting on the table in front of him, his fingers tracing invisible patterns in the wood grain. He had heard the news. He knew they had found the kids. He knew they had found Lacey. He knew they had found Ben. And he knew it wasn't over. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, twisted smile spreading across his face. The lake had given them back what it had taken, but it still held secrets, secrets only he knew, secrets only he could tell. And when the time was right, he would. Outside, the wind howled again, louder this time, like it was trying to warn someone, but no one was listening. Not yet. The wind howled through the trees as the search teams moved deeper into the forest, their flashlights slicing through the darkness like knives. Every step felt heavier now, like the earth itself was resisting them. The trail had gone cold before, but not this time. This time, they had something real, a name, a face, a pattern. Reginald Kane wasn't just a ghost from the past anymore. He was real, and he was close. Sheriff Braddock stood at the edge of the tree line, scanning the ridge ahead. The FBI had set up a perimeter around the old hunting cabin where the wildlife camera had caught movement just days before. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Kane wasn't stupid. He wouldn't stay in one place for long, but he was drawn to the lake like a magnet, circling it like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to descend. Back at the station, the caseboard was covered in new notes, photos, and maps. The timeline was tightening. The children had been found. Lacey had been buried with care. Ben had survived. But Kane had left behind more than just bodies. He had left behind a message, one that twisted and curled through every piece of evidence. Like a thread of madness, the journal recovered from the cabin had been analyzed. Its pages scanned and translated from the chaotic handwriting. It wasn't a confession, it was worse. It was a manifesto. A twisted logic that justified every act, every movement, every breath taken and given. He wrote about the lake like it was a living thing, like it had chosen him. He wrote about the Colson family like they were part of some divine plan. Like they had been meant to come to him, and then, there was the final line. Asterisk the husband is, the key, asterisk Ben Colson had read it in silence, his face unreadable. He hadn't spoken much since being brought in, but when he did, it was always the same question. Why me? Not in anger, not in fear, just exhaustion. Like he had spent 31 years running from a shadow, only to realize the shadow had been chasing him all along. The search expanded. Drones hovered over the treetops, scanning for heat signatures. Dogs sniffed the underbrush, barking at every rustle. Every officer, every agent, every volunteer had one mission: find Reginald Kane before he found Ben. And then, late one night, the call came. A motion sensor had triggered near the lake. Not on the main dock, not near the cabin, but deeper. Past the reeds, past the old root cellar. Past the place where the water turned black and the trees leaned in like they were listening. Braddock grabbed his coat and ran. By the time the team arrived, the area was silent. The camera feed showed nothing but trees and wind, but the sensor had picked up movement. Someone had been there. Someone had left something behind that was buried just beneath the surface, wrapped in plastic and tied with a length of rusted chain, a small bundle, no bigger than a shoebox. When they opened it, the smell hit first: mildew, decay. Time. Inside was a cassette tape, warped and waterlogged, but still intact. Forensics worked through the night. The tape was delicate, the magnetic strip frayed in places, but they managed to extract a few seconds of audio. Static, then a voice, low, distorted, but unmistakable. A child's voice, not screaming, not crying, just whispering. Then silence, then another voice, older, calmer, answering in return, not comforting, not cruel, just ... empty. The tape was played, again and again, each time revealing something new. The whispers changed, the questions shifted, the answers were always the same, that it was like listening to a conversation that had never ended. And then, just before dawn, the final piece fell into place. A forensic linguist compared the voice on the tape to the journal entries. The handwriting matched. The phrasing matched. The tone matched. The second voice, the older one, belonged to Reginald Kane. He hadn't just buried the children, he had talked to them, and now, after 31 years, he was talking to them again. Braddock sat in the interview room with Ben, the tape playing softly in the background. Ben didn't flinch when he heard the voices. He just closed his eyes and listened. "You think he's trying to finish what he started?" Braddock said. Ben nodded slowly. "I think he's trying to bring them back." The sheriff didn't respond. He just stared at the man across from him, the last surviving member of a family that had been torn apart by something neither of them could fully understand. And then, the call came in. A sighting. Reginald Kane had been spotted near the lake, just past the old cabin site. He was alone. He was watching, and he wasn't running. Braddock stood, grabbed his coat, and turned to Ben. "This is it," he said. Ben looked at him, his eyes tired, but steady. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for this a long time." Outside, the wind howled again, louder this time, like it was trying to warn them, but no one was listening. Not yet. The wind had changed over. Whispering Pines Lake, what once felt like a place frozen in silence, now pulsed with something heavier. The weight of too many secrets buried too long. The Colson family had been laid to rest. Their story finally told after 31 years beneath the water's surface and deep within the roots of forgotten earth. Reginald Kane was behind bars, his mind shattered by time and guilt, but not before leaving behind more questions than answers. And yet, for all the pieces recovered, for all the bones unearthed, one truth lingered just beneath the surface. This wasn't the end. It started with a letter. Sheriff Braddock had seen hundreds of them since the case reopened. Messages from families desperate for closure, cold case detectives chasing shadows, journalists wanting statements. But this one was different. No return address, no signature, just a single typed page folded neatly inside a thick manila envelope. "Greater than asterisk, you found 4 bodies. I know where there are more. Asterisk, no name, no date, just coordinates scribbled in the bottom corner. Braddock stared at the numbers, cross-referencing them. With old maps from the Whispering Pines Lodge archives, they pointed to a location deep in the northern ridge, an area known as Hollow Marsh, a dense tangle of cypress trees and blackwater that had never been fully searched during the original investigation. It was far enough off the trail system that most hikers avoided it unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. He called Detective Vargas first thing the next morning. She arrived with coffee in hand and eyes still half asleep. "Tell me this isn't another wild goose chase," she muttered, scanning the letter over her mug. "I don't know," Braddock admitted, "but Kane mentioned doors. He said the woods have places people walk through and never come out." Vargas frowned. "That's poetic and terrifying. You think someone else went missing out there?" Braddock didn't answer right away. He just handed her the map. The search team moved out by midday. The terrain was rougher than expected, the underbrush thick and unyielding. Every step sank slightly into the marshy ground, the air heavy with the scent of moss and rot. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning for heat signatures, while cadaver dogs sniffed the damp soil with quiet intensity. Then, just past noon, one of the handlers stopped short. A dog barked twice, then sat, ears twitching, toward the tree line. They followed the signal. Pushing through a wall of tangled vines, they came upon a clearing no one had mapped. In the center stood what looked like the remains of an old hunting blind, rusted metal frame, collapsed wood beams, and a chain wrapped around its base, like it had been trying to hold something down. One of the officers knelt beside it, brushing away leaves and dirt. Beneath the debris, he uncovered a small hatch built into the ground, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. "Sir," he called, "I think we found something." Braddock stepped forward, heart pounding. The hatch was sealed with a padlock so old it crumbled at the touch of bolt cutters. When they pulled it open, a wave of stale air rushed out, cool, damp, and laced, with something unmistakable, death. Inside, the tunnel sloped downward, disappearing into darkness. Flashlights revealed brick walls lined with mildew, wooden beams splintered from decades of pressure, and a narrow corridor leading deeper underground. They moved in slow, cautious steps. 50 feet in, the passage widened into a chamber. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned root cellar storage pits dug by early settlers to keep food cool in summer months. But these weren't filled with potatoes or apples. They were filled with bones, not animal, human. Dozens of them scattered across the floor, some stacked neatly, others tossed aside like discarded thoughts. A child's femur rested against a rusted lantern. A woman's skull leaned against a crumbling backpack. One corner held a pile of clothing, rotted beyond recognition, but still identifiable by faded stitching and brand tags. Vargas turned on her radio. "We need forensics down here." Now back at the station, the evidence room buzzed with activity. Analysts worked late into the night, cataloging each item, running dental records, matching DNA samples against national databases. What they found chilled even the most seasoned investigators. At least 12 individuals had been buried in that cellar, some dating back as far as the 1970s, all disappeared near remote lakes, cabins, or forest trails. All unsolved, and none of them matched the Coulson family. This wasn't just Kane's crime scene, it was a graveyard. Braddock sat alone in the interview room later that night, staring at the file folders stacked high on the table. Each one contained a name, a photo, a missing persons report filed decades ago and forgotten when no lead surfaced. These weren't just victims, they were people someone had loved, waited for, mourned. He flipped open the last folder. Inside was a Polaroid photo, a young couple standing beside a canoe, smiling, arms wrapped around each other. Behind them, a cabin nestled among tall pines. The caption on the back read, *Whispering Pines, 1989. *Bradock. Recognized the dock. He recognized the trees. He recognized the lake. It was the same spot where the Coulsons had taken their final photograph. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Kane hadn't just been hiding here. He'd been hunting, and he'd been doing it for years. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the windows like it always did when the lake remembered something it couldn't forget. Somewhere, deep in the woods, another door was waiting to be opened. And if history had taught them anything, it was that Kane hadn't worked alone. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Reginald Kane sat motionless, his wrists and ankles shackled to the floor like an animal that might still lash out even after the leash had been cut. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber as she read the final verdict. 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of unlawful disposal of bodies, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of child abduction, life without parole. No chance of release. The words settled over the room like dust on an old photograph, heavy, final, suffocating. Ben Coulson sat in the back row, hands folded, eyes dry. He didn't cheer, didn't cry. He just watched as officers led Kane away, disappearing behind a door that would never open for him again. Justice, if that's what it was, had come 31 years too late. Outside, the sun hung low over Whispering Pines Lake, casting long shadows across the trees that had stood silent, witness to everything. Sheriff Braddock leaned against his car, watching the last of the media vans pull away. Vargas stood beside him, arms crossed. "He'll never see the outside again," she said. Braddock nodded slowly. "But we still don't know how many others he took." Vargas frowned. "You think there are more?" He looked toward the lake, its surface calm, almost peaceful. "I think he wasn't done when he stopped here." Back at the sheriff's office, the case file was officially closed with a red stamp. But inside the evidence room, something lingered, not ghosts or curses, but questions. Kane's notebook had been cataloged, scanned, analyzed by profilers, yet some parts remained unreadable, scrawled in symbols, in strange handwriting. And then there were the maps, not just of Whispering Pines, but of other forests, lakes, cabins, scattered across 5 states. Red dots marked places no one had thought to look. One of those dots was circled twice, a place called Hollow Marsh. And that's where they found it, a second container, buried beneath layers of moss and roots, hidden beneath a collapsed hunting blind, sealed with the same rusted chain and padlock pattern. Forensics worked fast, cutting through the corrosion, opening it under sterile white tents while drones buzzed overhead and reporters hovered. Behind police tape. Inside were bones. 3 sets. 2 adults. 1 child. No names yet. No match in any database. Just another family, lost to time and silence. Back in Whispering Pines, Ben Coulson sat alone on the dock where it all began. The water lapped gently at the wooden planks, reflecting the sky in soft ripples. He held a small stone in his hand, worn smooth by years of waves. On it, he had carved 4 initials, MELE, and 1 more now, barely visible beneath his thumb. He dropped it into the lake without ceremony. Plunk. Behind him, footsteps crunched on gravel. He didn't turn around. "You knew, didn't you?" Vargas asked, standing a few feet away. Ben exhaled slowly. "Knew what? That he wasn't done." He finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, but clear. "I didn't want to believe it." She crouched beside him, lowering her voice. "We found another set. Different state, same pattern." Ben didn't respond. He just stared at the water. "Do you think he was working alone?" His fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. "I used to think so," he said quietly, "but lately, I'm not sure anymore." Vargas followed his gaze. "Why?" Ben turned toward her, his face shadowed by the setting sun. "Because the night he came for us," he said, "he wasn't alone." There was a pause, a long one. "What do you mean?" Vargas asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben looked down at his hands. There were 2 shadows in the doorway. One stepped forward, the other stayed behind, watched. Her breath caught. "You never told anyone this before." "No," he said, "because I didn't want to believe it." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, sharp, sudden, like a warning. Vargas stood slowly. "Did you see the second man's face?" Ben shook his head. "Only his outline. Tall, thin, and he was wearing the same jacket. The denim one." Ben nodded. Vargas swallowed hard. "Kane was wearing that jacket when he was arrested." "I know," Ben said. "So who was the man behind him?" For the first time since the case reopened, Vargas felt something she hadn't expected. Fear. Back at the station, Braddock reviewed the footage from the interview room where Kane had been questioned. He played the same segment over and over. The moment Kane smiled, not at anything said, but at something he seemed to hear from somewhere else. Then in the background noise, barely audible beneath the static, was a sound, a whisper, not from the recorder. From the room, Braddock froze the frame, then zoomed in on Kane's face. He wasn't smiling at them. He was smiling at someone behind the camera. Someone no one had seen, somewhere far beyond the trees, deep in the forest where the trails ended and the silence began. Something stirred. Whispering. Waiting. Watching. And in the heart of the woods, where no light reached and no voices echoed, another cabin stood untouched, its door slightly ajar. Inside, on the wall, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were 4 words: "The watchman is back." The wind had shifted again over Whispering Pines Lake. What once carried the weight of fear and silence now moved with something softer. The scent of pine, the hush of leaves, the distant call of birds returning to a place they had once avoided. The trees still stood tall, their roots tangled deep in the soil, but now they bore witness not to horror, but to healing. Ben Coulson had returned to the lake not as a fugitive, not as a ghost, but as a man who had finally been allowed to grieve. The weight he had carried for 31 years had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, no longer a burden of guilt and hiding. It had become something else, a responsibility to remember, to speak, to keep the names alive. The Coulson family was finally at rest, together, not in the way they had lived, not in the home they had built, but in the earth, beneath a sky that had once watched their disappearance and now watched their peace. The final burial had been quiet, attended by those who had searched the longest: Sheriff Braddock, Detective Vargas, a handful of locals who had never forgotten. The case, and a few strangers who had come to honor a story that had touched something deep in them. There had been no eulogy, no music, no fanfare, just the sound of dirt falling onto wood and the wind carrying the last of the grief away. Ben had placed a small photo on each casket, Maddie with her frog, Eric with his mischievous grin, Lacey wrapped in the same blue cloth she had once used to swaddle their children, and for Eli, the child they had never gotten to meet, he had drawn a picture for stick figures, a sun, and a tiny frog with a smile. The lake had taken them, but now it had given them back. Back at the sheriff's office, the file was officially closed, stamped in red ink, case closed. But for those who had lived through it, the end was not a relief, not exactly. It was more like the final page of a book that had been carried for too long, read in pieces, its meaning shifting with every year. Reginald Kane had been transferred to federal custody, his mind unraveling further with each passing day. He no longer spoke of the lake, no longer whispered about the voices beneath the surface. In the end, the man who had taken so much had become something less than human, a shadow locked behind steel and silence, forgotten even by those who had spent decades chasing him. But his words lingered. Doors. He had called them that in the end, not places, not crimes, but openings, passages between the world people knew and the one he had lived in. And as Sheriff Braddock reviewed the maps found in Kane's possession, he realized the horror had not ended with the Colsons. The red markings spread like veins across 5 states, into forgotten forests, abandoned cabins, and lakes that no one dared swim in. How many others had been taken? How many families had vanished without a trace? How many doors had been opened and never closed? Braddock didn't have the answers, but he knew someone would have to keep looking. Back at the lake, Ben had begun a new tradition: quiet water, free fishing lessons for local children, teaching them patience, the rhythm of the lake, and how to listen, not just to the water, but to each other, to the quiet things that needed to be heard. He never spoke of what happened in 1993 unless someone asked, and when they did, he answered honestly, without flinching, without anger, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He had learned that silence was not always peace. Sometimes it was pain, waiting to be spoken, and now, the story had been spoken. The Colson family had not vanished. They had not disappeared into nothing. They had been taken, hidden beneath water and earth, but not forgotten. And now, they were remembered not just by those who had searched for them, but by those who had never known their names until now. The wind carried the story now, moving through the trees, across the lake, into the hearts of those who listened. And, somewhere, deep in the woods, another door remained closed. For now, but the lake remembers, and the wind still whispers.